Hello and welcome to this Astranti Financial Training Real-World Industry Analysis for the November 2016 Strategic Case Study. My name's Alex, I'll be your guide, and during this video what we're going to do is go through the real-world industry analysis for ADF and pick out the key details that will help you succeed in your exam. This means that we won't be looking at the whole document, we'll merely be focusing on some of the key points to really add value in those areas. If you want to look at the whole document, please do so in your own time. So, if you're ready, let's get started. And the first thing I'd like to speak about is the history of the dairy industry as we scroll through to look at this. And in particular, I'd like to focus on what defines the modern era within dairy, that is, what means that dairy is at a different stage now than it has been in its history. Of course, as we know, dairy's been going on for centuries and it's almost as long as human civilization itself. However, in recent years, going back to the 1920s, mechanization has fundamentally changed the industry. For those of you that are interested, one fundamental breakthrough in doing this was the 1922 surge milker, which we can see here. Looking something like a kettle, it actually held off this really big leather belt you had to put under your cow and wasn't enormously practical. However, when we think about mechanization, automation and the issues surrounding intensive farming, the surge milker, invented in 1922, is a great thing to bring up to show that these issues surrounding mechanization have actually been going on for nearly 100 years. That said, it's important to remember that in the 1920s, animal welfare wasn't necessarily top of the list of priorities, and so the use we can use for the surge milker as a defence against accusations of animal cruelty due to mechanization or intensive farming are actually fairly limited. Anyway, I've got slightly distracted there, and let's move on now to the modern era. And the modern era is all about the rise of corporate dairy. Now what I mean by that is we're now in an era where traditional dairy farming techniques are simply no longer viable. They can't compete on price with some of the largest dairy corporations in the world. For example, there's one I've mentioned here, which is Fair Oaks Farm in Michigan, and they have over 2,000 cows which are kept indoors the entire time and farmed using intensive farming methods. As such, in the 21st century, for the first time in human history, it simply isn't viable to keep cows outdoors in a traditional setting and expect to sell milk at a sustainable price. One of the main reasons surrounding that price is the rise of supermarkets, because if you want milk, you tend to go to the supermarket. This has led to supermarkets having an absolute dominance on the retail of milk, meaning that they are able to dictate the terms of agreements with farms and meaning that the wholesale price of milk has stayed low for a decade. And if we think about that idea of supermarkets equaling that low wholesale price, what that means is that farmers are under increasing pressure to lower their production costs and to make that milk as cheaply as possible. Accordingly, this is forcing farmers into intensive farming methods, forcing farms to combine to form bigger collectives and indeed corporations, with one of the biggest collective corporations being American dairy farmers. As such, I really want to introduce you to this idea of a cyclical, symbiotic relationship. That is, supermarkets need low prices in order to compete with other supermarkets. They charge farmers or pay farmers a low price for their milk. This leads farmers into more efficient farming techniques, and this, in turn, allows supermarkets to charge a lower price. However, this is really reaching this crunch point at the moment, and this is because supermarkets have fallen into a trap of paying farmers a price which is actually below the production cost of their milk. This means that farmers are producing their milk at a loss, which is obviously not sustainable, with one UK newspaper noting that one farmer is leaving the industry every day. However, what happens is when that farmer leaves, his farmland may be purchased by another dairy farm, which, due to efficiencies of scale, and that expansion as a result of purchasing that farm, is then able to produce milk at a lower cost itself. Accordingly, we've got this almost compulsive, absolute drive towards intensive farms and towards larger farms. This is also a global phenomenon, as can be seen with the world's largest farm currently under construction in China, which will be home to, wait for this, 100,000 dairy cows. This is more than twice the size of the current world's largest, which incidentally is also in China. For those of you that are more interested in that one, have a little look in the industry examples at the end of the industry analysis, because that's one of the examples I've used. Now, if we think about what all of this means for ADF, we've got that pressure to use up-to-date farming techniques, but as we see from the pre-seen, they already used lots of intensive farming methods. What we've also got is that pressure for them to expand and to get larger. However, what if there's something they can do to interrupt that relationship with supermarkets, to make them less dependent, to take away some of the power that that customer has? After all, presently, if we think about supermarkets as a stakeholder in terms of Mendelow's matrix, they have very high power but very low interest, and it'd be great to get that power lower. With that in mind, the next thing we're going to look at is the product life cycle of milk. So here we're looking at the various phases that milk goes through, and the first thing you may be saying is that milk doesn't change. Fundamentally, you are absolutely right. Milk has been the same product for thousands of years, it has been consumed in roughly the same way for thousands of years, but within this idea of it just being the white stuff, we've got lots of different varieties, lots of subtleties and nuances in consumer habits, and within these subtle changes, these tides within the milk consumption patterns, we've got the ability for a company to make a fortune in reacting to these. For example, recent years has seen an explosion in the idea among consumers of dairy as a brilliant athletic substance. For example, people going to the gym will drink shakes because they believe in the powers that milk has in terms of giving them protein in their diet and improving the results of their workout. This is something that was inconceivable even 10 years ago, and so those dairy manufacturers that are able to react to that change are able to tap into a whole new market. This is just one of many examples of changing dairy consumption habits, which are a great opportunity if we're thinking about a SWOT analysis. Now, you still may not believe me, so let's take a moment to make this slightly more applicable to ADF, and the example I'm going to use is the American dairy industry. Now, in the 1950s, almost 100% of milk sold in America was full fat or whole milk. However, in the years since, the consumption of whole milk has dropped 80%, and what that means is a greater and greater number of people are instead choosing semi-skimmed or skimmed options, which removes a great deal of fat, enabling them to have a healthier milk. What this also means, and this is very, very important when we think about ADF, is that the skimming process, that removal of fat, is therefore increasingly important. And for those of you that don't know, this is done via centrifuging. Essentially, as you spin milk, the modules of fat go to the outside, that's skimmed off as cream, you keep going, until you've removed enough fat for it to be classified as skimmed or semi-skimmed. In ADF's example, it is the supermarket that does that for them. As such, if consumer habits mean that people want semi-skimmed and want skimmed milk, ADF are reliant on their relationship with supermarkets in order to supply that product, and that's a key weakness in terms of a SWOT analysis that we could talk about for the company. Indeed, thinking about the long-term viability of ADF as a business even, it could be a critical success factor for them to wrestle control away from that process, away from supermarkets, in order to have greater control of the product they are giving to customers themselves. Another great way of thinking about this is that, as supermarkets to customers, if they're the ones that are currently skimming the milk and currently making it into a product that customers want, after all, no one's drinking whole, that means that if we're thinking about Porter's 5 forces, the bargaining power of customers is extremely, comically, nay ludicrously high. Anyway, once again, let's jump back and actually look at this process from introduction to growth to maturity to decline. And what we're talking about here are different types of milk. So, for example, the consumption habits of whole or skimmed, or indeed the most recent new type of milk, the new classification in the European Union, is 1% fat milk. And so, as we can see, that the first thing we see is a changing dietary requirement among customers. For example, be it wanting a lower fat content from their milk, which is a great example for skimmed and semi-skimmed. It could be that they don't want to consume the lactose sugar, which is something we're going to come on to more and more, meaning that lactose-free products are introduced. Or indeed, for another example, for those of you that are interested, some consumers don't want to consume a protein within their milk called A1, leading farmers to breed cows that do not have this protein within the milk they produce, and the rise of a product known as A2 milk. So, we've got this changing dietary requirement, whatever it may be, and as a result, we respond to that, and the popularity of this type of milk continues to grow with increased consumption of that milk variant. As we reach maturity, this means that type of milk is widely consumed, with a great example being the current habits of consuming large quantities of skimmed or indeed semi-skimmed. And then finally we reach the decline phase. This is where those dietary requirements that made it logistically viable to make that type of milk suddenly means that it's not anymore. For example, if people become increasingly tolerant to lactose, which is extremely unlikely as an aside, that means that lactose-free products suddenly wouldn't be viable. The main decline, however, as we've seen, is in the consumption of whole milk, and that's the type of milk that's suffered, and that means that it's increasingly important, as we've already said, for ADF to centrifuge their milk themselves and take control of that process. Speaking of processes, I'm well aware that many of you may not be particularly familiar with the dairy industry. Don't panic, because what we're now going to do is look in very close, even patronising detail about all the stages of production that go into getting from a cow's udder to your cereal. And that means looking at the operations of the business. Okay, so here we have productions and operations, and what we're going to think about is what the important thing to succeed is at every stage of this process. That is, what do ADF need to do in order to make a profit? So, our number one stage is to have cows. This sounds incredibly stupid, but it's actually surprisingly difficult to maintain your dairy herd and to maintain numbers at a profitable level. For example, as we can see here, Quirtmal Farm in Wales lost 150 animals just like that, overnight, following an outbreak of botulism. Preventing disease is one of the key things that's important for keeping your herd healthy, and this means that the ADF decision to, shall we say, put animals out of their misery rather than indulge in expensive vet treatment may be an effective way of preventing the widespread spread of disease. That said, this process still has very serious ethical implications when animals are potentially being killed unnecessarily. The other critical disease that will wake a dairy farmer up in the night in a cold sweat is bovine tuberculosis. Now, TB is so important because it's incredibly contagious, and should TB get into your herd, you are likely to lose up to half of it to slaughter. Imagine that. Imagine ADF are barely making enough money to be profitable, and then they come to work in the morning and half of their cows have been slaughtered. Accordingly, a critical success factor for any dairy farm, but particularly one which already has such a small herd size, such as ADF, is to be able to effectively prevent the outbreak of disease. Another key idea when we talk about maintaining cow numbers is maintaining the correct bloodlines. This may sound daft, but what we mean is that we don't want excessive inbreeding. For example, if you have one bull that you are using to induce pregnancy in the rest of your herd, the next generation of cattle will be his daughters, and therefore you've started on a process towards inbreeding. This means that careful management of genetics and careful management of the herd bloodline is again a critical success factor towards ensuring that you have cows of optimum health, meaning they need the least medical treatment and are therefore better financial assets, but also ensuring the long-term viability of your business model. Just as an aside here, we can talk about that idea I briefly mentioned earlier of A2 milk, where that milk is deliberately structured to take out one of the proteins, and that's just one example of the really complicated things you can do through correctly managing your bloodlines of your cattle. Anyway, let's move on with our process and say that we've got sufficient numbers of cows. What's the next stage in our productions? Well, we need to keep those cows in good health, not just from disease, but from illnesses and ailments that could be particular to them being dairy cattle. For example, one big problem is an infection called mastitis affecting the udders, and this can be put down to dirty, unclean or potentially damaged machinery. Cows with mastitis, which is contagious, will have the bacteria in their milk. It may make them non-productive, but more importantly, if found in your milk supply, as a dairy farmer, it means that all of your milk's confiscated and you can face very serious financial consequences if it's found you haven't been doing enough to prevent infection. However, we've somewhat brushed over the biggest problem when maintaining cows, and that's feeding the hungry little devils. Cows can eat, wait for it, up to 50 kilos of food per day, which is an enormous quantity, and this is a great challenge for farms who are looking about how they produce this volume of fodder. We know from the pre-seen that ADF produce all of their food themselves, and this is in the form of haylage, with many also using silage. However, many farms also substitute or supplement this with total mixed ration or TMR. Now, TMR is made up of a variety of grains, minerals, vitamins and feed additives. For example, many use human throwaways of human consumption, such as ground shells of peanuts, things like sugar beet, vegetable waste, in order to give their cows a greater amount of vitamins, a wider variety of feed, and also an intense bulk of feed. As such, if we think about ways for ADF to improve their herd, it could be that feeding them TMR will improve their milk yields, effectively making them more efficient, widening the margin that they have on that milk, and therefore making them more profitable when compared to the same wholesale price. In terms of thinking about models that's applicable to, it's obviously an opportunity with regards to SWOT. The technology required for TMR arguably makes it a T in your PESEL analysis, and it's also the operations stage of the value chain. As we move onwards then to consider the next stage of this process, it's worth saying what we've already said here about maintaining the health of the cows being one of the key things with regards to maintaining your cows. As we think about that, we can think about the particulars of intensive dairy farming, those unique characteristics that mean cows may be kept inside for prolonged periods of time and may also be required to stand on high standing for longer periods of time than is otherwise typical. What that means is that it can be prone to a number of hoof complaints and lamenesses, which are a particular focus for animal rights groups including PETA, and they can also be prone to a number of skin complaints due to an inability to roll, lack of contact with grass, and a lack of access to direct sunlight. As such, one of the key ways of preventing this is giving them access to outside, which isn't an economically viable option, but principally giving them a clean environment. Any cow which has a hoof defect or a hoof injury will quickly become infected, for example, if they're required to paddle around in their own excreta. And there's a word I don't often get to say in an SCS analysis. Oh, excuse me. As we move on to think about milking, this is the key process. Thank you for watching this Astranti financial training video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and more importantly, I hope you found it useful. Now please allow me just to bring your attention to a few other products that we currently have on offer with regards to the case studies. Now the first is our study text, and these are available for every single CIMA examination, and these will give you all of the theory that you need in order to really excel during the case study. We also offer a range of course videos, and these will help you with technique and with learning how to structure your answers in order to make sure that your knowledge is displayed in the best possible way during the exam. We also do the pre-seen analysis, in which we look through the pre-seen for each case study in microscopic detail, picking out every little detail that could be worth marks and picking out what we think are the most likely topics for examiners to use during the exam. Similarly, we also offer an industry analysis, which, when used to the pre-seen analysis, gives you loads of industry information, and this is all really good real-world stuff that you can bring in to support your answers to make sure you give the very best answer possible. In checking that your exam is as good as it can possibly be, you may want to take one of our range of mock exams, which are designed to simulate as close as possible the experience you will have during the exam, and, through getting marking and feedback, will allow you to know just how close you are to getting the best possible marks. For those of you wanting even more in-depth tuition, we also offer a range of masterclasses in which you'll have the opportunity to ask questions within the Astranti tutor, and they will give you even more information in order to make your answers as good as possible. And finally, we offer our pass guarantee, meaning that even if the exam does not go quite as perfectly as it could have done for you, you're able to resit it again and make sure that you fulfill your full potential. Thank you very much for watching, and if you're interested in any more products, please visit www.astranti.com. Thank you.